In this video, we want to talk about testing in Swift. The first place we need to go is in the app test file. Now notice that all we have here is this basic class. We have this really simple function, test nothing, which we'll look at in a second, and then we have some tests. Now, this is the basic setup of any test. When you're looking at a test, the answer is pretty simple. You want to first grab some value and then prove that it should be so. And all you have to do is set up this condition of creating test conditions and then asserting that exactly what you expect should be that value. In this video, we're going to write a very simple test. We're going to make this a little bit more complex as we go along, but it's for us to understand kind of the thinking behind testing. So first things first, let's look at Xcode for a second. Now you should notice these weird little squares or diamonds on the left-hand side. Now notice that I can run a single test or I can run all my tests. Let's click it. What we'll notice is that our project should first build, and then once this is finished, it's going to run our tests. While we're waiting for this to build, I also want to point your attention to this symbol that looks similar. It's our test navigator. And we should see in app test, our class, our method test nothing. As you can imagine, as your project grows, you'll have a lot more of these classes. For example, you'll have them for models and controllers, and you're going to have several tests. Once it's finished building, you should see your test run. Once your build has succeeded, it's going to start testing. And there we have it. Our tests have succeeded. One thing that's interesting is you could also actually just run a singular test. And so it will eventually tell us that our test has run. Now let's think about some tests that we can write. We're going to write a really basic test. Now if you remember, we have this method in our user.swift. And basically what we set it up to do was we have this public user method, and the public user takes in our user, right? So it takes in our user, and then it does something, right? Now, most simplest test we could think of is that if we have a user, we want to prove that a public user that is init based on this user doesn't change the values in any way. It doesn't modify the username, it doesn't change the ID, nothing of the sort. So why don't we do that? So let's go to our test. I'm going to write a new test. I'm going to call this test public user init. And our test throws. And now we need to set up our environment. So let's create a user. And so our user is going to have one thing to note here is that we're not able to use our init method. Easiest way to figure this out, and for anybody familiar with iOS, we have to make this a testable import. This is going to bring in all of our methods and classes that we made in our application. So let's try that again. And there we have it. Let's give it a username, Johan, password. We're going to call this Vapor Test. And let's also make a public user. And our public user, we want to see whether or not the public user, the init method, whether or not the username that that public user has is equal to the username of user, right? Considering I fed my user on line 13 into the init on line 14, they should be the same. Nothing should happen. And so what we're now going to do is write xct assert. And these are called matchers. They basically say that I'm asserting that one thing can be the next thing. And you can see a couple of asserts in here. We can assert that something can be nil. We can assert true. We can assert false, not nil. Something doesn't throw. Less than, more than. And you could really get creative with these. Let's do a simple true case. So we're going to assert equal. And notice assert equal takes two things. And we're going to write a little message. We're going to say that user, username, and public user, username, are going to be the same. And so we're going to create a message and say that public user init keeps user value. So let's now, to wrap it all together, we're going to add something to this array, and we're going to write test public user, and we're going to use our method test public user in it. And so now, why don't we just run our test? We're going to let it build, and then we're going to see what happens. And there we have it. Our tests pass. Let's try something else. Let's just watch it fail so we get to see something interesting. Let's watch what happens. And so there we see it fails. So you could even take this further. We can say XCT assert not equal, and let's try user.password and public user.username, because those should not be equal. And so notice we have two tests that are concerning each other together. Let's test, and there we have it. And as you can see right here, it is also updated. So this is the basics of testing. Setting up your test and then making certain assertions. We have these expectations of one thing on the left should be equal to one thing on the right. Or we could also even do a basic assert where it says that some method will return something.